Giorno Giovanna is a perfect character. Oh, sorry, got a little ahead of myself there. Let's try that again. Jojo's Bizarre Adventure isn't exactly a work that would, at first glance, lend itself to nuanced and grounded characterization. However, series author Hirohiko Araki is actually known to be someone who puts a lot of thought into every fiber of his work. In his book, Manga in Theory and Practice, he lays out just how much work he puts into creating the crazy and weird people that inhabit his wacky and bizarre universe, with a massive, immensely detailed spreadsheet being used to catalog numerous aspects of the personality and role in the story. While it would definitely be fun to properly explore Araki's general approach to character writing, that video already exists by the wonderful X-Forts, so if you're interested, you should go watch that instead. I, however, would like to talk about one very specific character, Part 5's protagonist, Giorno Giovanna. Giorno is a bit of a weird case when it comes to Jojo, as he's one of the least popular characters in the series, often being called boring, uninteresting, and bland. And while there are a few possible reasons to this, I believe the main cause is that Giorno's character works off of something that many people simply do not expect in Jojo, and therefore immediately dismiss without a second thought, and that something is subtlety. Yes, I know, but hear me out. Most main JoJos have one standout feature that defines them. Jonathan had his justice boner, Joseph had his line prediction, Jotaro had his yada yada daze, and Josuke had his hair. So when Giorno appears and has no single immediately defining feature, it's easy to see why people are put off. They simply do not expect a character to not have these immediately recognizable aspects of them. Even his dream line, which many people meme, is actually only in the series 3 whole times, so it doesn't quite compare to the character-defining traits of other JoJos before him. But if you decide to detach yourself from that preconceived notion and pay close attention to how Giorno carries himself, it is actually pretty easy to find that Giorno is among the most compelling and interesting characters Araki's ever conceived, at least in my opinion. Or you could just watch this video and see if you agree to what you want. I'm not your dad. Giorno is introduced to us as a bit of a crook. Stealing luggage, scamming tourists, and skipping school, this lad seems relatively unruly. This is further compounded by the information that he is, in fact, the son of Dio, big bad of the whole series. However, all of this information also clashes with aspects of his actual attitude and behavior. He is outwardly friendly, charming, and generally seems quite, well, nice. So from the get-go, we experience a conflict between these two poles, a conflict that continues to define Giorno, and a conflict he himself seems to be somewhat aware of, as he seems to build various facades and masks to resolve them. When Bucciarati begins his interrogation in the tram, Araki uses that scene to actively show these facades one by one. When Bruno first approaches him, Giorno is relatively relaxed and friendly, as he would be with just anyone, giving an honest answer to Bucciarati's bizarre question while still retaining a very relaxed posture. However, after Bruno mentions the possibility of him being a police officer, Giorno shrinks before tensing up, building a first facade of a more reserved and careful young man. And once Bucciarati reveals his intentions, Giorno fully transitions into a dispassionate, cold persona, much more reminiscent of what we saw prior in his confrontation with Luca. This small scene basically summarizes what Giorno is about. His character revolves around the dichotomy of a kind-hearted soul living a life that requires it to be cruel and cold. Or, in more poetic terms, Giorno is basically a Jonathan that lives in an environment which forces him to be Dio. As his reaction to the death of Super Mario in the Black Sabbath arc shows us, he is fundamentally a righteous and just individual, yet those qualities are conjoined with a cruel indifference toward those that oppose him. And Giorno's central conflict revolves around fully resolving and fusing these aspects of himself into one complete, unique personality. Which at first he does by using the aforementioned facades. Fake it till you make it is the name of the game, and Giorno plays it resolutely. In the world of gangsters, he puts on a tough persona and channels his Dio traits while remaining superficially dispassionate, also being an imitation of the mafioso who saved him. This is a direct consequence of the abuse and neglect he suffered as a child, internalizing that showing emotions such as crying is pointless, leading him to default to putting up these dispassionate fronts. But fronts are all they are, as he, at heart, remains a teenager who is way in over his head. Brief moments of panic and exasperation, cracks in a mask, show us as much. The anime actually goes a step further by having his spoken dialogue be mostly reserved and calm, whereas his inner speech and thoughts are consistently emotional and expressive, both in sub and dub.
覚悟してきてる人ですよね。人を始末しようとするってことは、こいつの攻撃をこれ以上食らうのはまずい。バラバラになっちまう。
However, once he enters the life of stand battling, this duplicitous mechanism begins to fail him. While bravado and confidence are certainly important, they alone cannot make you prevail when pitted against the likes of the Squadra Esecuzione. A central theme of Part 5 is the idea of accepting oneself and one's fate and facing them both head-on, undeterred by what you might encounter and making no excuses. And just like the rest of the cast, Giorno too is forced to confront this idea. In the early fights, Giorno remains relatively inconsequential and faces quite significant barriers. His calm facade fails to convince Abbacchio to cooperate during Soft Machine. He is basically useless against Kraftwerk, bumbles about cluelessly for the majority of Man in the Mirror, and has his ability be mostly unhelpful during White Album. His experience simply outweighs what little good his facades can do for him. Some people like to call Giorno a Mary Sue or Gary Stu, an overpowered, flawless character that faces little adversity and is therefore uninteresting. This is already an incredibly misused term, but applying it to Giorno is simply absurd. Giorno's fatal flaw is his inexperience in actually backing up his hard-boiled gangster bravado, a flaw that causes him to get pretty roughed up and hurt in almost every fight he's in. Having your arm split in half and your ribs obliterated doesn't really sound like little adversity. However, as we discussed in our Big Golden Wind video, a consistent element of Part 5 is that to succeed, you have to be willing and able to face your fate head-on, not running from it, and that those who manage to do that are inevitably rewarded. And Giorno simply embodies this idea. His experience fucks him over multiple times, but every time, his resolve turns those fuck-ups into victory and opportunity. By not letting his failings stop him and instead diligently and relentlessly pushing forward, giving all for his dream of a drugless Italy, he manages to turn all of his fuck-ups around and come out victorious. He is not a flawless character, but rather a character who consistently overcomes his flaws by ways of creativity and ingenuity. In every fight he's in, Giorno either wins or creates an advantage by overcoming his fears, facing his adversary, and using his powers in new and creative ways that the enemy couldn't have predicted. Although he is absent for most of the fight, his quick thinking allows Mista to find Sale and Capri, and while he bumbles about cluelessly for much of the fight in Pompeii, he manages to create the final opening by transmitting the virus onto Illuso. Even in a fight like White Album, where his power alone isn't enough to fully defeat Ghiaccio, he makes the winning move by sacrificing his arm, revealing Gently Weep's ice shards, and inspiring Mista into one last shootout. Giorno consistently outsmarts and outspirits his opponents, being willing to go to extreme lengths and suffer enormous pain to achieve victory. Essentially, he's just more of a fucking mad lad than his enemies, and thanks to that, he can overcome his own limitations and move forward despite his inexperience. Even as people die, as he suffers, he moves forward undeterred, determined to face his fate and to face himself and who he is, and finally become whole. Alongside this, he also develops and deepens his understanding of his stand, Gold Experience. Throughout Part 5, Giorno comes to adapt his application of Gold Experience quite significantly. While he at first only really uses the Life Giver as a means of escape or distraction, he continuously improves his utilization of it, becoming more and more creative and smart in how he uses it, from his life shot to the fucking bike hand. And while every shonen protagonist inevitably improves their abilities, here in Jojo the context of the power system is very important. Stands aren't just random powers, but manifestations of the soul, the very essence of the user's being. Gold Experience isn't Giorno's power, it's Giorno given spiritual form. Under that lens, his continuous growth in wielding his stand becomes a lot more interesting. Giorno gaining a deeper understanding of his stand is symbolic of him understanding and applying himself better. As the part goes on and his mastery of Gold Experience improves, he becomes more honest with himself and who he is, being able to more freely transition between his Jonathan and Dio parts, not hiding anymore behind facades, but instead being generally more real and expressive, while also being a lot more useful and dangerous in combat. He still gets hurt a lot, he still is overall somewhat reserved, but he continues to face more aspects of himself and his power and turning them into strengths. A great example of this is his fight against Babyface, where he applies his stand in a completely new and never before seen way, which teaches him how to heal wounds, paralleling him slowly developing a more kind-hearted persona while dropping the gangster act. He also uses that ability to immediately kill the stand equivalent of a newborn, showing that his Dio side is still there, but that it can coexist with kinder aspects and abilities. But all of this finally comes to fruition during his second to last fight, where he faces Cioccolata. As he now stands at the precipice of his final fight with Diavolo, Giorno must overcome anything and everything that holds him back and fully embrace who he is if he wants to conquer the Requiem. And that is exactly what he does. Giorno uses every bit of intellect and creativity he has to knock Cioccolata out, and then, for the final blow, he finally becomes whole. By tapping into a heroic speech about letting Cioccolata live if he surrenders, he channels his inner Jonathan perfectly. But by betraying this speech and killing Cioccolata after he lets his guard down, he uses his Dio aspects. By doing this, he successfully marries and combines his two halves into a full whole, finally becoming his own full person instead of switching between the two constantly. This development allows him to seize the Requiem arrow and finally become a true gangstar, someone who accepts and understands himself and whose radiance has and continues to inspire those around him. The masks fall off and his true self can finally shine and bathe Italy in the golden glow of justice. And this is where we could conclude this video. However, I am fucking insane and obsessed with this fictional 15-year-old kid, so let's go further. So far, we have talked about Giorno as the character, as the emulation and representation of personal qualities and growth. But now, let's look at Giorno as a narrative element. Because, like in every good story, the characters are also crucial elements to push the narrative and thematic ambitions of the work. While Giorno is working on discovering his own true nature and disbanding his facades, he continues to serve one singular purpose. He is a beacon of light whose radiance illuminates the path towards the gang's ultimate fate. Or, in less flowery terms, he is the guiding light that inspires his friends to push forward. Even through his masks, his uncompromising resolve to see his actions through to the end is what drives the people around him to continue facing their fates as well. Giorno's endless determination is what catalyzes his team into action, making him a sort of a savior, a symbol that promises change and justice to those that follow him. Essentially, Giorno Giovanna is Jesus Christ. Okay, I know, I'm increasingly starting to sound like an insane person, but hear me out. With the part set in Italy, the center of Catholicism, religious symbolism is very hard to avoid. So, wisely, Araki decided to just go full force on it. Giorno is the son of Dio. Dio is Italian and means God, and is often used to refer to the Christian gods specifically. Meanwhile, Giorno means day. So what we have is the son of God bringing about a new day, a new dawn. So yeah, Giorno is already conceptually a good candidate for a Jesus figure. Add this to his role as a guiding light, and the fact that he can bestow the gift of life, and heal the wounded, and yeah, this reference is getting pretty fucking obvious. And here's the best part. This isn't just there to be a cool little reference, but rather it pushes the themes of the part even further. Giorno is bestowed with the role of a savior, the mantle of the guiding light of resolve that carries his team to victory. But he himself isn't really ready to take up that mantle, as he still initially struggles to combine his Dio and Jonathan sides into one meaningful whole. But precisely because he moves forward despite his troubles, does his resolve shine bright enough to lift up his comrades. By facing himself, his characteristics, and his role in the story as a savior head-on, Giorno achieves truth and is granted the Requiem by fate, an ability made to vanquish Diavolo, who himself is named after the Italian word for devil, in front of Castel Sant'Angelo, the tomb of a once powerful but cruel king. In conclusion, Giorno is not the most profoundly written character in all of existence, neither is he the focal point of tomes upon tomes of characterization. But what he is the archetype of a savior figure given context and executed to perfection. Araki took two of the most iconic characters in all of manga, Jonathan Joestar and Dio Brando, and combined the personalities into an inherently conflicted pile of justice and cruelty. He then forced the role of protagonist and discount Jesus onto this creation, which causes an even more inherent conflict. And the character overcoming that conflict and moving forward towards destiny despite it is then a natural emergence from his creation, which then furthers and develops the central theme of facing your fate. Much like Part 5 as a whole, Giorno is an idea polished to utmost brilliance and efficiency. Giorno's mere existence, his conceptual birth, already creates a natural embellishment of Part 5's themes and message, while still retaining Giorno as his own character. That is simply good writing. Or, I guess in short, Gordo Experience Requiem! Giorno Giovanna is a perfect character.